Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome everybody. Uh, Again, I want to remind people this online event is now being recorded and will be made available on YouTube. Um, Please keep your microphone muted, and video is optional. If you don't, especially if you don't want to be recorded, just turn it off. But I would like to welcome you to this session. Why debates about pre-registration are debates about philosophy of science. This session is part of the Research Transparency Campaign, whose goal is to increase awareness of pre-registration and other open research practices that are necessary to ensure transparency in the research workflow. This campaign is organized by the Erasmus Research Institute of Management, and Lisette Guzman Ramirez is one of the organizers. Also organized by the Erasmus University Library, Mutaleni Nadim is one of the organizers, and Erasmus Research Services with myself. My name is Antonio Schettino, and I'm Coordinator Open Science at Erasmus Research Services. Among the things that I do, I develop educational and training materials on open science for students, researchers, and support staff. I also directly support researchers in implementing open science in their workflow. So if you want to open up your projects, just send me an email and I'll do my best to help. Also, please consider joining the Open Science Community Rotterdam, where researchers and support staff help each other in learning, discussing, and adopting open science practices. For more information, there will be the website in the chat. In today's session, we'll talk about how some debates surrounding the usefulness of pre-registration often depend on the philosophy of science that you subscribe to. Our invited speaker is Daniel Lakens, Associate Professor in the Human Technology Interaction Group at Eindhoven University of Technology. He's a very influential figure in psychology, especially meta-science, research methods, and applied statistics. He's very active on Twitter, has a very informative blog, and two very popular courses on Coursera that I really recommend you check out, and we will put all the links in the chat. Before giving the floor to our speaker, a few reminders. Please keep your microphone muted during the session. Video is optional. As I said, you're being recorded, so if you prefer to have the video off, just do it. Although we encourage you to turn it on so that the speaker does not have the feeling that he's talking to a cold, lifeless screen. And if you have questions, there are two ways to ask them. After the talk, you can click on the raise hand button. We will give you the floor so that you can ask the question yourself. Or you can write down your question in the chat, and after the presentation, I can read it on your behalf. That's it for me. Daniel, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. Nice to be able to talk to this, and the whole session. I think all of these talks are going to be very interesting, I'm pretty sure. I will talk a little bit about the link between thinking in a very principled way about whether you want to pre-register or not, and what the benefits of this are supposed to be, because there's a bit of a risk that this pre-registration practice in itself becomes a heuristic, and people really don't know why they're doing it and whether it matches the goals they have. So in my experience, it's always nice to think about what is the goal? Why are we doing this? Does this match basically my philosophy of science, for example? Now, there's a bit of a distinction between terminologies. It's useful to distinguish. So there are study registries. Those exist. They have existed for a long time in medicine, for example. Also in parapsychology, was an early adopter. And these exist to just show other people that a study exists or not, so that it has been performed. Regardless of whether it's been published in the end, the registry says we've done it. Now in psychology, we also have registered reports. So these registered reports are a publication format where we submit our ideas and analysis plan beforehand. They have the goal to both restrict freedom and flexibility in data analysis, but also then to share the results. So these registries don't actually do this in medicine. In psychology, we propose these registered reports to also combat publication bias in the end. There are already some interesting findings from these kind of interventions. Basically, you can think of these as interventions, changing the way we do science. So for registered reports, it's pretty clear that if you look at the normal literature, most of the findings that are submitted for publication and published in the end show positive results. They show what researchers expect. But in a recent paper, we looked at what happens in registered reports, and there the probability that you'll read a registered report that supports the predictions is much lower. So there's definitely something going on in the normal literature that doesn't really reflect the same thing that you get if you're completely honest and transparent about things. That's interesting to keep in mind. Now, these study registries can require a pre-registered sampling and analysis plan. They don't have to. But if they do, we can also take a look what happens if people are required to specify this pre-registered analysis plan. So this is a study from 2015 looking at what happened around the year 2000 when researchers were required to specify their primary outcome on clinicaltrials.gov. So in this slide, you see the years. The year 2000 is when this started. If you look at the years before and you check for large clinical trials funded by the Lung and Blood Institute of Heart, Lung and Blood Institute, about 17 out of the 30 trials that are published show significant results. So these are small pluses. The blue dots are no results. So more than half of them show positive results. From the moment in the year 2000 when people have to specify their analysis plan, so they don't have this flexibility anymore to analyze their data, the success rate drops to 2 out of 25. So this is another indication that there is something going on here if you restrict people's flexibility in analyzing data, which might indicate that there is some use to be gained in practice from requiring or asking people to pre-register, right, in practice. Now, this itself is nothing new, like the idea that you should be honest about what you planned and what you came up with afterwards. Nothing new. And honestly, I think that we haven't really added much interesting literature beyond this book by Adriaan de Groot from 1969. Some clarifications, maybe, you know, it's useful, but I think everything that you need to know is basically in this very old literature, if you look at it. So here he already says that, you know, if you design a test of a hypothesis, you can't really be untransparent about the part where you just explore things and then present them versus the part where you really make a prediction and test it. So he says that these kind of misleading practices where you pretend like you predicted something strike at the roots of open communication among scientists. It's nice. It's a good sort of you know, clarification. But what we can do is a little bit better, explaining why this is problematic. We tried in a paper in 2014, but we didn't also say very clearly what it is, but we were also sort of in the right direction. We'll get closer to the point later. So this is in 2014 when I think we published the first registered reports in Science or Psychology in this special issue for replication studies. And here we say, you know, in an exploratory analysis, p-values lose their meaning in the sense of a Neyman Pearson hypothesis testing approach, which I think is the only logical way to use p-values, because there's an unknown inflation of the alpha level. So initially, I think pre-registration was presented as an approach to make it possible to now what I would call audit a p-value or to check its error probing capacity. And this is based on work by Deborah Mayo, a philosopher of science who wrote a book Beyond the Statistics Wars, which I highly recommend. It really ties so many of the things we're talking together. What's the problem with hierarchy? What's the problem with p-hacking? All these things make a certain test lose its error probing capacity, or in her terminology, it makes it impossible to evaluate how severely you tested a hypothesis. So the goal is to make sure of pre-registration is to make sure that you have this severe test, or even better, actually allow others to see how severely you have tested something. That's the goal. Of course, when psychologists write about it, they didn't all read this book. Well, the book was published in 2018, so maybe, you know, they couldn't have. But sometimes they're a bit loose when they talk about this. So, and enthusiastic about it. So they'll say things like, after all, confirmatory studies are much more compelling than exploratory studies. Or they write something like a registered report has substantially higher truth value than registered studies. Or something that like this improves the credibility of findings if you pre-register. And those are well-intentioned but loose and not very specific statement about what's going on. So in practice, a confirmatory test can be much more compelling or have improved credibility or a higher truth value, but it might also not. Now, I'm pretty sure that we can bet that if we take a look at what will happen, and if we had all-knowing power about the consequences, that most of these things in practice work. On average, I think we improve things just because a lot of researchers admit that they lie and they cheat and they don't really adhere to the code of research integrity. They selectively report. I mean, they admit these kind of things. Well, if we have scientists who admit that they do these things, then it is probably likely that if we prevent them from doing these kind of things, that the studies improve. Of course, it's not true for any single study. And the risk is that we're going to use pre-registration as a way to evaluate whether any single study is more likely to be true or not. Now, that is not really how it's supposed to work. The goal of pre-registration is not just to say, okay, it has a badge, now it's a better study. That's not the goal. If we have this desire to make sure that something is severely tested, then we want to give people the ability to see how severely it is tested or evaluate this for themselves. And that's the goal of pre-registration as far as I can see. The goal of pre-registration is to allow others to evaluate the severity of a test by transparently communicating what you predicted in advance and then what you did after this. Now, this evaluation itself might make you feel that this is an impressive prediction in everything, or not. You might be like, your pre-registration sucks. This is very stupid pre-registration. And trust me, we are writing very bad pre-registrations right now. Of course, I mean, we weren't educated about this. We're figuring this out. So many of them will not be very impressive. Some will be, and in the future, more and more will be of a higher quality, I hope. So it's not necessarily that any study that is pre-registered is better than a non-pre-registered study. I think the problem mainly is that when we learn to do this stuff, we're figuring it out as we go. That's a very common thing in science, I think. We're figuring it out. But we start and we had a hunch or a feeling like, yeah, this is good for some reasons, but maybe we couldn't put the finger on exactly why this is. So we have to think about the basic principles that justify pre-registration. Why are we actually doing it and what's the goal? And that necessarily means you will have to discuss what the goal of science is. And this is a point where different people can have very different opinions. So according to certain philosophies of science, pre-registration makes sense. But from other perspectives, it doesn't make sense at all. So I think that a large part of the discussion, especially when people start to, debate with each other, I very quickly zone out because I don't find this interesting unless there is a very clear specification of what their philosophy of science is to begin with. In my experience, also my extensive experience discussing frequentist versus Bayesian statistics, for example, another one of those topics people love to debate on Twitter, it is all a difference in philosophy of science. That's the only difference in the end, if you get down to the core. So we should talk about this a little bit. And as far as I can see, pre-registration is something that should be valued by people who have a philosophy of science where we increase the trust in claims that people make if they have been severely tested. This is a very specific philosophy, starting with Popper, built on by Imre Lakatos, and now, in its most detailed version, explained by Deborah Mayo. It's an error statistical philosophy. You want to make sure that if you make a claim, you had a very high probability of being proven wrong when you were wrong, and that you prove yourself right when you're right. That's the goal. It's very simple. But if you have a high probability of achieving this, severely tested your prediction, then we are impressed. It's a little bit like if I want to convince you that I'm a good darts player, I will tell you, look, I'm going to hit the bullseye. I specify in advance what you can expect. Then if I hit the bullseye, you are impressed. Of course, what we do in science is very different, right? Very often what we do in science is, I'm going to hit the bullseye. Now, could you please leave the room and come back in 5 minutes? And then something happens and we don't see what, and you enter the room again and you see there's a dart in the bullseye and you're like, yeah, but did you just walk? I mean, So the whole point of transparency and pre-registration is to allow other people to see, oh, I see what you did there. You actually really threw it in. I see. Oh, yeah, now I'm really impressed. So that's an analogy of what this severity approach tries to do. And it's fine not to care about severity or predictive successes at all, right? You might not care. But if you care, and this is your philosophy of science, then pre-registration has a function. And as far as I know, I'm still waiting for other people to make coherent claims from other types of philosophies. I have not seen them. So as far as I know, this work by Deborah Mayo, this error statistical philosophy where we try to have severe tests of hypotheses where our predictions are likely to be proven wrong or confirmed if we're right, yeah, that's the only perspective from which I can see that there's a coherent argument to pre-register. Yeah, as far as I can see, that's the only philosophy it follows from. So that is basically, I think, the core, what I want to say. It's important to limit yourself, if you argue for the value of pre-registration, to this philosophy. Because otherwise people say, look, that's not what my goal is. And of course, if you would start to require everybody to pre-register, yeah, then they might complain and say, look, this is, first of all, I don't make predictions. I don't care so much about hypothesis tests in this classical sense. Or maybe they say, look, I have, for example, a Bayesian philosophy where the data just speaks to me and I update my beliefs based on the data. And whether you predicted it beforehand or not doesn't matter. And there are many Bayesians. Keynes is an example. That doesn't care whether you predicted it or after the fact. The data is the data, and whether you predicted it or not, same updating happens. So that's all fine, you know, that's fine. If that's your philosophy, then indeed you don't care about pre-registration. But this is at the core what it does. Now I think it's important to know this. We can distinguish it from what you could call positive externalities. There are other things pre-registration also does, and many people advocate for pre-registration for those reasons. One of them is it makes people think about what they do. Well, I can hardly argue against this, you know, of course, yeah. And if you need that, by all means, you know, maybe we could have a different intervention that does the same thing. That is, before you collect data, you have to sit on your hands for 3 hours. And you can't type or program an experiment or do anything. You just have to sit and think. That would be the same thing, right? People would think a bit more, also good. So most of these other benefits that it has are benefits, but benefits we can achieve in another way. Doesn't mean that pre-registration is not a nice way to combine a lot of these benefits, but if you want to discuss the usefulness of something, you have to keep them apart. So most of these other benefits can also be achieved through other interventions. The only unique thing, again, as far as I can see, that pre-registration gives us is this thing where if you care about a predictive success, the pre-registration allows me to evaluate the severity of your test. And again, sometimes that makes me impressed, sometimes not. If you pre-register, for example, a linear model, and I think you should have pre-registered a polynomial model, then I don't really think that if you don't find what you predicted in your pre-registration, it wasn't really impressive, right? But at least I know that this was your prediction. I can take a look at whether I think that was a good prediction. And if I agree, and it's confirmed or not, then I evaluate it as a severe test. But I can also, of course, dismiss the whole prediction because I don't agree with it, right? And then your test isn't something that I care about so much. But again, maybe in terms of this analogy, if we don't specify what we do and I just throw the dartboard, yeah, sometimes I get lucky and it ends up in the bullseye, right? And if I didn't call my shot beforehand, you're not that impressed. So that's what it's trying to do. And yeah, being sharp about that, I think, is useful. Yeah, that is basically all I wanted to say. And we have some room for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I see no questions as of now in the chat. Oh, but there is a question. So Anna, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Hi, and thanks for the presentation. The way you described it, the example with like saying that you're very good at playing darts, and then you and then you throw the arrow and so on. I still find that quite different from how it happens in real life, because the way I see pre-registration is that people submit a paper to a journal, and then they say, hey, we had this pre-registered, and surprise, surprise, we find that the data supports what we said, but we didn't tell you in advance. And actually, is there any way at all of knowing that the authors did not pre-register all the possible outcomes? Like, I just fail to see the utility of a pre-registration in this situation.
Yeah, I like your skeptical attitude. And I mean, in my view, there's a huge personality range in science where people say, but what you just said is so distrustful of fellow scientists. That can't be a way to be a scientist. You have to trust your fellow scientists. But there are some people who say, no, I don't trust them at all, you know, and I am somewhere more maybe in your direction. So I agree that what we allow people to do is say that they pre-registered, but we're not really sure, first of all, if they pre-registered many different things or not. Now, in practice, there are already some choices you can make. First of all, and many people don't seem to know this, but if you pre-register on the open science framework, your pre-registration will become public after 4 years. Many people don't seem to know.
And I cannot delete it. I cannot delete that pre-registration at all.
You can delete it, but it will always show that there was a pre-registration that has been deleted. So you can pretty much hide exactly what's done. But if I see there were 12 pre-registrations on the same day, and one of them is linked to an article, then I know. Then I can say, well, what were those other 11? Yeah, and there are other platforms that don't allow this. So, for example, Predicted is also a place where you can pre-register, but it will hide them. So, as far as I'm concerned, I would never recommend somebody to use Predicted. I could even predict that people who want to have this flexibility, like you say, like, hey, if it works out, I'm going to point to it. But otherwise, those people are using Predicted. The strategic people who use Predicted, the people who care about most transparent approach would use the open science framework. I mean, both are fine. Both are better than nothing. But if you are so skeptical about things, then the open science framework approach tries to bridge this a little bit, right? So that's a nice first step. And again, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you are going to tell your PhD students, you know what? When I was pre-registering in the beginning, we could just have all these loopholes and stuff, you know, they didn't tie this down. Now, of course, we have to, you know, so in 20 years, it will be more to, in line with what you would like to see, I think.
If I make it in 20 years, I'm not tenured.
We'll see. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm a bit mindful of time, and I would like to ask you, Daniel, a question that we ask all our presenters. If you had to choose one open science practice that is necessary to ensure transparency in your field, what would it be?
Well, I think probably sharing data is the most beneficial. You know, it's just the most beneficial. You get so much out of it. And if everybody had to share the data of studies they collect, it's probably going to get the most cost-benefit analysis-wise. It will give us the most. So that's the answer. Pre-registration is something we probably would like to do, in my views, for a very specific set of studies, like registered replication reports or those kind of things. You know, you see in medicine, they require them for clinical trials, but not for everything. So you say, okay, these are the important things where you really want to be sure. There we pre-register. And I'm actually also okay with a little bit less hypothesis testing in psychology in general. I mean, you don't pre-register, you just have descriptive statistics. And then you're like, okay, now we're in a place to really test this theory, and boom, we go for it.
Yeah. I know, for example, some work coming out of your lab specifies exactly this kind of position. For example, Anne Scheel and Tjokin, they basically talk about this. Perfect. Okay, so I don't see any other questions. So I have one question for you, because of course, I mean, I've got several, but I'll start with one. Sometimes I see that researchers are some researchers are a bit concerned that pre-registration will become somehow compulsory. You have already hinted at this a little bit, that there is this feeling that probably it will be somehow expected to some extent. And some researchers are even saying, some journals will require it, even if it doesn't really make a lot of sense for the kind of study that I'm conducting. And some journals already do. They already, they're very few and far between, but there are some journals that are saying, no, we only accept pre-registered studies. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of requiring this for all studies, but I'm in favor of requiring it for a specific type of studies, exactly like it happens in medicine. So if you say, look, I am really testing a theoretical prediction here, well, that is basically the point where, you should do this. But there's a bit of a risk that if we require everybody to pre-register everything, we get a lot of meaningless pre-registrations. And it's a waste of time. And also, it will just make people not enthusiastic about the whole practice. Because rightly so, they think, why am I doing this? I'm jumping through a hoop. But this doesn't make any sense. So we should have a very principled implementation of where we think this is important enough to do. So I think that's basically pretty important. We will likely overshoot. So I think in practice, people will not listen to what I say. I think in practice, most people will overshoot and make this much wider requirement than is sensible at this point, because this is how pendulums go, right? We allow people to have all flexibility, hide everything. The pendulum is swinging too far in the opposite direction now. That will likely happen. I wish people would listen to what I say, but they don't. And then it goes back, and we'll be like, oh yeah, you know what? Actually, we haven't looked at these pre-registrations. These are useless, messy things for these kind of studies. Stop doing it there. That's probably more likely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we are perfectly on time. It's now 10:30. So I would like to thank you again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. I would like to thank all of you who joined us for all the events on the Research Transparency campaign. There will be a link in the chat. Thank you all for your participation, and enjoy your day, and see you soon.